when Thomas Whitfield stumbled upon a cluster of rock shelters in the steep ravines of western North Carolina during the winter of 1823, he witnessed something that challenged everything he knew about construction. Native Americans had engineered these mountain dwellings with such precision that they could withstand avalanches, mudslides, and brutal ice storms that regularly destroyed settler cabins below. These weren't primitive lean-tos or temporary camps. Cherokee families had been perfecting these shelters for generations, creating structures that combined natural rock formations with carefully placed reinforcements, strategic positioning, and drainage systems that would impress modern engineers. The sophistication of these designs would eventually force even the most stubborn European settlers to abandon their prejudices and learn from the people they had dismissed as savages. European settlers arriving in the Appalachian highlands brought their log cabin designs from the lowlands and flatlands of Europe. They built in valleys for easy access to water, used traditional corner notching techniques, and assumed their methods were superior to anything indigenous people could create. The mountains taught them otherwise, often through tragedy. The winter of 1823 to 1824 brought unprecedented snowfall to the Appalachian highlands. Settlers in their valley cabins faced a threat many hadn't considered: avalanches. Heavy, wet snow accumulated on steep slopes above their homesteads, sometimes reaching depths of 15 to 20 feet. On exposed mountainsides, when temperatures fluctuated between freezing nights and warming days, the snow layers became unstable. Massive snowslides roared down mountainsides, burying cabins and claiming lives with terrifying regularity. Thomas Whitfield's family cabin had been partially destroyed by a snowslide in early February. The avalanche had struck at dawn, tearing away the entire north wall and burying their winter provisions. His wife Sarah and their 3 children had survived only because they'd been sleeping in the southern portion of the cabin. But they were now exposed to temperatures that dropped below zero at night, with little food and no way to rebuild until the snow melted. Desperate and freezing, Whitfield ventured higher into the mountains, searching for timber to rebuild, despite warnings from other settlers that the upper elevations were too dangerous. The logic of mountain survival eluded him. He thought lower meant safer. He was about to learn otherwise. That's when he found them. Tucked beneath massive rock overhangs, positioned at precise angles on the mountainside, were shelters that showed no damage whatsoever. Smoke rose from carefully concealed vents, and he could see signs of habitation. Children played in protected areas where the snow barely reached. Cherokee families were living comfortably in structures that had survived the very avalanche that destroyed his home below. In fact, they appeared to be thriving while settlers were dying. Whitfield approached cautiously, knowing that relations between settlers and Cherokee families in this region were tense, but not openly hostile. What he learned over the following weeks would save his family's life and eventually spread throughout the settler community, though the indigenous engineers who developed these techniques rarely received credit in the historical record. The first lesson was location, and it was the most counterintuitive for European minds. Cherokee builders never placed shelters in the obvious spots settlers preferred. They avoided valley floors, which seemed protected but actually channeled avalanches with devastating force. They avoided direct slope faces where snow accumulated and released. They avoided areas beneath long, uninterrupted inclines where snow could gather momentum and become unstoppable walls of destruction. Instead, they built on ridgelines where wind prevented dangerous snow accumulation, on protected slopes that lay in the shadow of higher peaks, and beneath rock overhangs that acted as natural deflectors. They studied the mountain itself with the attention of scientists, observing where snow accumulated and where it released. noting patterns across seasons and years. One Cherokee elder, a man named Tsali, who spoke some English, explained to Whitfield that the rocks themselves told stories. Lichen patterns indicated prevailing winds and moisture levels. Water stains showed historical flood levels. Cracks and fractures revealed structural weaknesses that might worsen over time. Moss growth patterns indicated which sides of formations received the most moisture. This wasn't superstition. It was generational observation translated into engineering principles that worked. Tsali took Whitfield to several sites, showing him abandoned shelters that had been used for generations, then abandoned when subtle changes in the mountain indicated they were no longer safe. A shift in a rock formation here, a change in water flow there. Cherokee builders read these signs and moved before disaster struck. European settlers, by contrast, often stayed in dangerous locations until tragedy forced them to leave, if they survived at all. Shelters were positioned at angles that allowed avalanches to pass over or around them. The rock overhang acted as a shield, deflecting the force of snow and debris. But Whitfield learned that the positioning alone wasn't enough. The structures themselves required sophisticated design that accounted for multiple threat factors simultaneously. Cherokee builders used a combination of stacked stone walls and wooden bracing that created flexible yet sturdy structures. Unlike rigid log cabins that could shatter under impact, these shelters incorporated a degree of give that absorbed force rather than resisting it directly. This principle, deflection rather than resistance, was foreign to European building traditions. The stone walls weren't simply piled rocks. Each stone was carefully selected for size, weight, and shape. Larger foundation stones, some weighing several hundred pounds, created a stable base that wouldn't shift even under extreme pressure. Interlocking patterns prevented individual stones from moving independently. Smaller stones filled gaps, and the entire structure was built with a slight inward lean that increased stability under pressure from above. Wooden posts weren't driven straight down, but angled to brace against the rock overhang and distribute weight across multiple support points. These posts were selected from hardwoods, oak, hickory, and locust, that had been fire-hardened, making them resistant to moisture and rot. The fire-hardening process involved slowly heating the wood to drive out moisture and increase density, a technique that took days of careful attention. The connections used cordage made from plant fibers, particularly basswood and hemp, but also friction joints that held fast without nails or metal hardware. Whitfield watched as Cherokee builders demonstrated how properly fitted wooden joints could be stronger than nailed connections, especially when the wood swelled with moisture or contracted with cold. The organic materials moved together, while nailed joints in settler cabins often loosened and failed. What amazed Whitfield most was the layered construction. The outer wall faced the elements, but behind it was an air gap of 6 to 8 inches, then an inner wall. This created insulation that kept interiors warm while preventing heat loss that might melt snow above and trigger slides. The air gap also prevented moisture from penetrating to the living space, keeping the interior dry even during extended periods of rain or snow. Fire management was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of these shelters, and the feature that most clearly demonstrated the sophistication of Cherokee engineering. Settlers built large fires in their cabins, creating massive smoke plumes that could be seen for miles. This not only revealed their locations, but also created dangerous heat fluctuations that affected snow stability on slopes above. A large fire would warm the rock face, melt snow, create water flow that weakened snowpack, and potentially trigger the very avalanches settlers feared. Cherokee fire pits were smaller, more efficient, and designed with ventilation systems that dispersed smoke so thoroughly it became nearly invisible. The smoke vents didn't lead straight up. They curved through stone channels that cooled the smoke and released it in multiple small streams rather than one obvious column. The channels were built into the rock walls, sometimes extending 20 feet or more, before releasing smoke at various points along the rock face. The fires themselves were built using specific wood combinations that had been perfected over generations. Hickory and oak provided long-lasting coals without excessive smoke. Certain types of dry cedar added pleasant aroma and insect-repelling properties. Green wood was never used. All fuel was seasoned for at least 2 years. The fire was never built directly on the ground, but on a platform of stones that radiated heat long after the flames died down. This steady, controlled heat was safer and more efficient than the roaring fires settlers depended on. Whitfield noted that he could stand 50 yards from an occupied shelter and never see smoke, even though families inside were cooking and staying warm. This concealment had obvious defensive advantages during periods of conflict, but it also reduced the risk of melting snow above and helped maintain stable conditions on the mountainside. The Cherokee had learned that working with the mountain's natural systems was far more effective than fighting against them. Spring snowmelt and heavy rains posed another deadly threat: flooding and mudslides. A shelter that survived winter avalanches could still be destroyed by water in spring. Cherokee builders incorporated drainage systems that channeled water away from living areas with the precision of modern civil engineers. Channels carved into rock directed water away from shelter entrances, sometimes running 30 feet or more to deposit runoff in safe locations where it couldn't undermine foundations. Stone-lined ditches diverted streams before they could approach shelters. These weren't simple trenches. They were carefully graded to maintain water flow without causing erosion, with stone placement that created natural check dams to slow water during heavy flows. Inside the shelters, floors were slightly elevated and sloped to prevent water accumulation. But the most impressive feature was the use of gravel beds beneath living areas. These beds, sometimes 3 feet deep, absorbed moisture, prevented frost heave, and created dry living spaces even during the wettest seasons. The gravel was carefully selected for size and composition. Too fine and it would compact and lose drainage capacity. Too coarse and it would be uncomfortable to walk on. Settlers' dirt floors became muddy quagmires every spring, breeding disease and discomfort. Cherokee families stayed dry, healthy, and comfortable. The difference wasn't just quality of life, it was survival. Respiratory illnesses that killed settler children were far less common in properly ventilated, dry, indigenous shelters. The shelters also incorporated cold storage areas that extended deeper into rock formations, taking advantage of the stable temperatures found underground. These natural refrigerators maintained consistent cool temperatures year-round, typically between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, preserving meat, dried foods, and medicinal plants far longer than settlers could manage. Air circulation was carefully managed through small vents that prevented the storage areas from becoming too humid or too dry. Too much moisture would cause food to mold and rot. Too little would dry out preserved meats and make them inedible. The Cherokee had learned to balance these factors perfectly, creating storage systems that could preserve food for months. Whitfield observed that Cherokee families rarely faced the starvation that plagued settler communities during harsh winters. Their shelters weren't just protection from the elements. They were complete survival systems that integrated food storage, water management, temperature control, and structural safety into a unified design. Every element served multiple purposes and supported the others. What Whitfield came to understand was that these shelters also served important social functions. The compact, efficient design meant that extended families could live in close proximity without overcrowding. Multiple shelter units were often built near each other, creating small communities that could support each other during harsh weather while maintaining independence. The shelters were designed for multi-generational living. Elders had spaces near the fire where they could stay warm. Children had protected areas for play and learning. Young adults could come and go while supporting the family unit. This social structure contributed to survival in ways that isolated settler families, scattered across the landscape in individual cabins, couldn't match. Cherokee communities shared knowledge, food, and labor in ways that increased everyone's chances of survival. When one family's food stores ran low, others shared. When repairs were needed, neighbors helped. This cooperative approach, combined with superior shelter design, created resilience that individual settler families couldn't achieve. When Whitfield returned to the settler community and described what he'd seen, reactions were mixed and often hostile. Some dismissed his accounts as exaggeration or fabrication. Others insisted that European methods were inherently superior and that learning from savages was beneath them. A few expressed interest but worried about appearing to go native and facing social ostracism from their community. The winter of 1824 to 1825 changed those attitudes. Another series of avalanches destroyed homes, and several settler families perished in the cold. Whitfield and a few others who had quietly begun incorporating indigenous techniques survived comfortably. Their families stayed warm, dry, and well-fed, while neighbors struggled and sometimes died. Gradually, more settlers adopted these methods, though often without acknowledging their source. They built beneath rock overhangs, improved their drainage, reduced fire visibility, and repositioned their homes on safer slopes. The techniques worked, saving lives and reducing suffering, but history books would later credit frontier ingenuity and pioneer resourcefulness rather than indigenous engineering. What settlers struggled to understand was that these weren't just building techniques, they were complete knowledge systems developed over thousands of years. Cherokee and other indigenous peoples had observed, tested, failed, adjusted, and perfected these methods across countless generations. Each generation added to the collective knowledge, refining techniques and passing them down through careful teaching and practice. They understood the mountain as a living system where everything connected. Snow depth related to wind patterns, which related to forest density, which related to wildlife movement, rock stability related to water flow, which related to seasonal patterns, which related to plant growth, fire management related to forest health, which related to available game, which related to community survival. Settlers saw individual problems requiring individual solutions. Indigenous builders saw interconnected challenges requiring holistic approaches. This difference in perspective meant that even when settlers copied techniques, they often missed crucial details. A shelter might be positioned correctly but lack proper drainage, leading to spring flooding. Fire pits might be improved but ventilation inadequate, causing smoke problems. Walls might be reinforced but built without the proper lean, reducing stability. The complete system worked because all elements functioned together in harmony with the mountain environment. By the 1830s, as Cherokee communities faced forced removal along the Trail of Tears, many of these mountain shelters were abandoned. Some settler families moved into them, finally appreciating their sophisticated design after years of dismissing indigenous knowledge. Others fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the forest as nature erased evidence of the engineering genius that created them. The engineering principles, however, survived in adapted forms. Appalachian building traditions that emerged in the mid-1800s incorporated rock positioning, drainage systems, and fire management techniques that originated with indigenous builders. Modern avalanche safety protocols echo the same site selection principles Cherokee engineers practiced centuries ago. Contemporary sustainable architecture rediscovers principles of natural ventilation, thermal mass, and site-specific design that indigenous builders perfected generations earlier. Yet the story often told is one of hardy pioneers conquering the wilderness through determination and European know-how. The indigenous engineers who actually solved these survival challenges rarely appear in those narratives, their contributions absorbed into frontier knowledge without attribution. This erasure wasn't accidental. It served the narrative of European superiority and justified the displacement of peoples whose knowledge was supposedly primitive. The Appalachian Mountains demanded respect, and they killed those who refused to give it. Native Americans had learned to work with the landscape rather than against it, developing shelters that survived conditions European designs couldn't withstand. When settlers finally acknowledged this reality and adopted indigenous techniques, survival rates improved dramatically. Lives were saved by knowledge that had been dismissed and disrespected. Thomas Whitfield never forgot what he learned during that desperate winter of 1823. He built his new home using Cherokee principles beneath a rock overhang with proper drainage and concealed ventilation. His family survived decades in those mountains, while others continued to struggle with inadequate designs. He taught his children what Sali had taught him, passing on knowledge that bridged two cultures, though he always credited its true source. The lesson was clear. The knowledge dismissed as primitive was actually sophisticated engineering perfected through generational observation and testing. The real primitives were those who refused to learn from people who had already solved the problems they faced. Pride and prejudice killed settlers who might have lived if they'd been willing to learn. In the end, the mountains themselves were the teacher, and indigenous peoples had been the best students. European settlers eventually learned the same lessons, but only after paying a heavy price for their assumptions about whose knowledge mattered. The shelters that survived avalanches weren't built on European engineering principles. They were built on centuries of indigenous wisdom, observation, and respect for the land. That truth, like the shelters themselves, deserves to be preserved and remembered.